Okay, General Ghazi, thank you very much for talking to me today. How should military leaders respond to climate change impacts as a national security threat?
Right, to begin with, we've been dealing with traditional threats. We're looking at territorial context, We're looking at sharing of resources or access to resources, denial of resources. These have been all things that we've had in the background of our training and our commitment to find solutions for. But what climate change has done is that it has now moved this threat away from just simple ideological or territorial context into an area where there are consequences for which military scenarios will need to be built. For instance, you can have inundations in certain areas because there is flooding that's taking place, and that has impact on the kind of operations that can be conducted. Or there is desertification that takes place in certain areas, and that needs changes in equipment, and changes in terms of tactics, and changes in terms of plans, etc. Now, military leaders, therefore, need to reassess themselves. Right now, there is not that great an understanding for them to really visualize what the impacts on their operations will be. And I think for military leaders to make a national emergency out of climate change consequences, they have to realize that they may have to contend it during their lifetime. One of the problems with policymakers is that a lot of them see in their short-term tenures and do not look at things beyond. So one of the things that I do as part of the GMAC is that I go and lecture the younger officers. I tell them that 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line, you will be dealing with this scenario. So you better start preparing for it now. I can't tell it to somebody who is going to retire in 2 years or 4 years' time, because for him the immediacy does not exist. And therefore I think there is a great deal that we as military people need to do to be able to understand the linkage and then incorporate it in our planning processes.
Okay. And when you talk about understanding this means that you're doing your own research in real time and developing a kind of overall strategy in real time, because these impacts are sort of escalating, but they're all new, but not new, but more extreme, if you like. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true, because it's a self-learning process. It has not yet become a standardized practice. I think in Europe, you're far ahead in terms of the understanding of the security challenges from climate change. But elsewhere, there is not that urgency yet. And therefore, it is not a subject for study in military colleges or in institutions or in operational understandings. And therefore, that is an area that I think we need to create for ourselves. Because right now, it's only those of us who are dealing with it out of pure curiosity who have educated themselves on this looming threat.
You mentioned a moment ago regarding the difference between an ideological threat and something that's very tangible, like a climate change impact, and you have these sort of cross-border issues. Water, which you talked about in the panel, is obviously going to be on the horizon. Is there a strategy for avoiding cross-border conflicts?
Yes, you see, one is a realization that water is the one element on which everything else depends. So your food security depends on it, your livelihood security depends on it, your cleanliness, everything else, your forestry, all depend on water. So there is a realization that exists. Because there has been too much of water, we've been very complacent about its use. As it becomes more scarce, I think people are now getting to sit up and notice that there is a scarcity. And this scarcity means that it'll have an impact on certain things. So you've seen, the yields go down. You've seen refugees moving from areas that have been devastated because of lack of water. You've seen socio-economic tensions as a result building up. And therefore, societies are now realizing that there is greater competition that will arise because of the lack of resources, and especially water resources. Now, what you can do is to set up mechanisms that are cooperative in areas from the upper riparian to the lower riparian, from the rainfall affected to the flood affected, to the non-irrigated to the irrigated. And so a synergy needs to be created between different sectors of the water sector. And within these, we need to come up with a mechanism that will allow fair use, which will allow non-competitive use, which will allow also optimum use, maximizing the potential from the water. Not wastage, but creating good crop patterns, creating good habits that are agriculturally more modern, and that will give you the kind of yield that you want despite having consumed less water.
It's interesting that you say that there's a chance for cooperation instead of conflict, and that's very encouraging. And does that signify that there's almost an involved role for the military in dealing with climate as a crisis, instead of necessarily going off to fight wars?
Yeah. The trouble is political leaders will only understand some of these threats when you give them numbers of how many people are going to be devastated by it, how many votes they are going to end up losing, or how much territory they will end up losing, or it's territory that will go waste. And therefore, those are numbers that make the political leaders and national leaders stand up. And what the military can do is to carry out the kind of research that translate these threats into tangible numbers that then wake up both the government and the civil society into understanding that we need to do something about it, and therefore set up that kind of mechanism that will enable them to cooperate.
And what you're talking about here is basically national security. It's just a different threat. And around the world, we see incidences where national security is climate change is top of the agenda for national security, and yet the governments of those countries just look the other way and say, well, there's no worry here. How can citizens rest assured that the military has got their back, even if the politicians haven't?
Yeah, you see, one thing is that the people must feel that they are responsible. Now, unfortunately, in undeveloped countries or underdeveloped countries like ours, the people think that this is the rich country's problem. It's not something that was created by us. We are very low on the emissions platform. We are very, agrarian and therefore non-industrialized. We haven't contributed to the problem that the world is facing, and therefore we bear no responsibility to correct it. It is the responsibility of those rich countries. Now, it starts hitting you when it matters. Because if you are suffering from extreme climate events, you are being displaced by floods, or heat is creating pandemics of a certain nature, and therefore you want solutions. Now, in those solutions, I think the best thing for the world to do is to come forward and help in finding those solutions and transmitting those solutions to these people. And within that, it's the military that becomes, in disasters, the first responders. And the military contributes a great deal. I know that in Pakistan, and I think in the rest of South Asia as well, the military is trained to pre-position itself for disasters. We know that in the monsoons there's going to be flooding in certain areas, so we'll go repairing all the embankments, we'll go repairing all the bridges, we'll station troops to accept refugees, to house them, to regulate them, and to provide them with food and shelter, etc. Now, all of that is part and parcel of something that we've gotten used to. The trouble is that climate change is now making it very erratic. So the traditional times, I remember we used to, when we were young officers, we simply went out in June and did our work because we knew that's how the monsoon was going to come around. Now, you don't even know. The monsoon may not come in June, it comes in September, and suddenly you have to deploy yourselves, you're employed in something else. So there is this resilience, I think, that is needed in the kind of deployments that we need to take, the manner in which we can assist people in disaster management and in rehabilitation as well.
Okay, so it's almost increasing that resilience response in a way. With all your experience, what's your biggest concern as we move forward from now?
I think my biggest concern, especially in the areas in which I live, is water. Is the reduction in the flows of the river Indus, on which in my country the people depend on, through either human activities that are damming and diverting waters and making the lower riparian suffer. Now, if the intention is to make the lower riparian suffer because there are certain geopolitical or political reasons for which you want subservience or compliance, then I think it is the trigger for a catastrophic conflict taking place. Because at the end, when you have no security of livelihood left, then the eventual option is to go to resort to arms to actually retake it. And that last resort is something that I see happening in terms of water threat. The second, of course, is that there is going to be a great deal of socio-economic upheavals as a result of migratory patterns that will be set up, not necessarily cross boundaries, but more in boundaries. So there is going to be an intra-country movements that will be displacing and creating pressures on certain societies because they have it there, the resources, to those people who have moved from areas in which there were no resources or where they were just deprived of them because of some climate event. And you're talking of earthquakes, you're talking of floods, and you're talking of just simply failure of crops and hunger and poverty. And as a result of it, a lot of this shift also that takes place from the rural areas into the urban. So urbanization is the third big threat that you can look at coming forward. And as more and more people pile up in a very restricted zone, then you're looking at pandemics and large kind of health problems occurring as a result. And then social tension that could then lead to kind of conflicts that took place in the past with criminal activities and criminal gangs trying to benefit from it and therefore leading to more chaos in society.
Thank you very much. It's been really interesting to talk to you. Thank you.
Great pleasure.